The process server found me in the parking lot of my own office, holding a stack of blueprints against my chest like a shield. "Dana Ellery?" "Yes, you've been served." He handed me a thick manila envelope and walked away before I could ask a single question. I stood there in the June heat, blueprints slipping from my arm, and read the top line of the first page. Corey J. Ellery versus Dana M. Ellery, complaint for quiet title and constructive trust. My own brother was suing me for a house I had bought from him 6 years ago. A house I had paid for. A house I had the deed to, framed in my hallway like a joke neither of us had laughed at in years. I read it twice before the shaking in my hands made the words blur together. Corey wanted Blackwater Point back, our parents' lake house, the place where our father taught us to skip stones and our mother buried her wedding ring in the garden the year she left him, only to dig it back up 2 days later because she couldn't stand not knowing where it was. 6 years ago, Corey had begged me to buy his half. Now he was standing in front of a judge claiming he never sold it at all. I looked up at the sky, at the ordinary Tuesday clouds drifting over an ordinary parking lot, and I thought, he actually thinks he can do this to me. I had no idea yet how close he would come to succeeding. I'm an architect. Structural work, mostly the kind of job where a single miscalculated load-bearing wall can bring a building down on people's heads. I've spent 15 years being careful, documenting everything, trusting nothing that isn't written down and signed in triplicate. Which is exactly why, sitting in my car outside my office with the complaint spread across my steering wheel, I felt something colder than fear. I felt insulted. Corey and I grew up in Blackwater Point, Michigan, in a lake house our grandfather built with his own hands in 1961. When our parents died, our father from a heart attack, our mother 18 months later from what the doctors called complications, and what I privately called a broken heart, the house passed to the two of us equally. I loved that house. Corey loved what it was worth. 2 years after the funeral, his restaurant in Traverse City collapsed under a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices and a lease he never should have signed. He called me at 11 at night, voice thick with whiskey and panic, and asked if I'd buy out his half of Blackwater Point. "I need out, Dana. Clean and fast. I can't keep paying taxes on a place I never use." I said yes because he was my brother, and because, if I'm honest, some small, selfish part of me wanted the house entirely to myself. We agreed on a price, $210,000, half its appraised value at the time, because Corey wanted cash fast, more than he wanted top dollar. We used a notary in town, a woman named Ruth Cassidy, who had processed half the property transfers in our county for 30 years. I wired the money in 2 installments. He signed the quitclaim deed. I recorded it at the county clerk's office myself, in person, 3 days later. For 6 years I paid the taxes. I fixed the roof after the ice storm. I replaced the dock after a windstorm tore half of it into the lake. I never once heard Corey express regret. Then, 4 months ago, a development company called Larkspur Shoreline Partners bought the 11 acres next to Blackwater Point and started talking about a private marina community. Overnight, lakefront land in our little corner of Michigan tripled in value, and overnight apparently my brother remembered that he used to own half of it. "He's saying the sale was never a sale," my lawyer told me, flipping through the complaint at her desk 2 days later. Her name was Priya Nair, sharp-eyed, unhurried, the kind of lawyer who read every footnote twice. "He's alleging the $210,000 was a loan, that you offered to hold his share while he got back on his feet financially, with an understanding that he could buy back in whenever he wanted." "That's insane," I said. "We had a notary. We had a deed. I recorded it myself. He's not disputing the deed exists. He's disputing what it meant. He's claiming fraud in the inducement that you convinced him to sign a formal deed, when what you'd actually agreed to, verbally, was something closer to a loan with the house as collateral. There's no verbal agreement. There's a wire transfer. There's a notarized document." Priya tapped her pen against the file. "Do you still have the wire transfer records?" I opened my mouth to say of course, and then I stopped, because a small, cold thought had crawled up the back of my neck. 6 months ago, a pipe had burst in the basement of my old house before I moved. The storage unit where I kept my banking archives from that period, old statements, old paperwork I hadn't yet digitized, had flooded. I'd lost boxes of records I never thought I'd need again. "I might not have the originals," I said slowly. "There was a flood." Priya's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "Then we need to find everything we can, fast. Bank records can be subpoenaed from the bank directly, so that's recoverable. But if he's building a narrative and you can't immediately produce your paper trail, it makes his story sound more credible than it should." I drove home that night with my hands too tight on the wheel, replaying every conversation Corey and I had ever had about that house, searching for the moment he'd started rewriting our history. The next call came from our Aunt Louise, who still lived 2 streets from Blackwater Point and considered herself the unofficial historian of every Ellery family dispute since 1988. "Dana, honey, Corey says you tricked him," she said, without so much as a hello. "He says you knew he was in a bad place financially and you took advantage." "Aunt Louise, I paid him $210,000 for his half of a house. That's not taking advantage, that's a real estate transaction." "Well, he says it wasn't supposed to be permanent." "Did he tell you that at the time? 6 years ago when it happened?" A pause. "No," she admitted. "But he's your brother. Family should help family, not profit off each other's hard times." I hung up feeling something in my chest crack a little. It wasn't the lawsuit itself that hurt most in those early weeks. It was watching family members I'd known my whole life absorb Corey's version of events like water into dry soil. Simply because he'd said it first and said it loudest and cried while he said it. By the end of the month, my cousin Marisol had stopped answering my texts. My Uncle Ted sent me a single message, "Hope you two can work this out," that managed to sound both neutral and like an accusation. I sat alone in my kitchen most nights that summer, staring at printouts of the original deed, wondering how a piece of paper that felt so solid to me could be treated by everyone else as a rough draft. 3 weeks before the first hearing, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Ellery, this is Ruth Cassidy. I understand from your lawyer's office that you're trying to reach me." Ruth Cassidy, the notary who had witnessed the original sale, had retired to Arizona 2 years earlier and, according to the county clerk's outdated records, had no working phone number on file. Priya's paralegal had spent 11 days tracking her down through a niece's Facebook page. "Ms. Cassidy, thank you for calling back. I know it's been years, but do you remember notarizing a property sale between me and my brother, Corey Ellery, around 6 years ago?" There was a pause, then the particular sound of someone shuffling through old memory rather than old paper. "The lake house, Blackwater Point? Yes, I remember it. I remember it specifically because your brother made a joke while he signed something about finally being a free man. I wrote it in my log because it struck me as an odd thing to say during a property closing." My breath caught. "You still have your notary log from that period?" "I keep everything for 10 years, dear. State requirement and old habits besides. I can send you a copy of the entry. It has the date, the document type, and both your signatures logged." When the scanned page arrived in my inbox that night, I read it 4 times. Ruth's careful cursive listed the transaction plainly. Quitclaim deed property transfer sale, both parties present and lucid. No objections raised. Under notes, she'd written, "Mr. Ellery stated he was glad to be done with the place and wished his sister well with it." It wasn't the bank record, but it was a sworn, contemporaneous account from a neutral third party, made at the exact moment Corey now claimed had never happened the way I remembered it. For the first time since the lawsuit began, I let myself breathe. The bank subpoena came back 2 weeks later, and it told its own story. 2 wire transfers, 3 days apart, totaling $210,000, sent to an account belonging to Corey J. Ellery. The memo line on the second transfer read, in the bank's own coded shorthand, R.E. Property Buyout, Lake HSE. I hadn't written that memo. The bank system had auto-generated it from a description I'd given the teller in person 6 years earlier, standing at a counter with no idea that sentence would one day matter this much. Priya called it a small miracle. I called it proof that the truth, even buried, tends to leave fingerprints. But Corey's lawyer wasn't finished. 2 weeks before trial, they filed a new exhibit, a handwritten letter, allegedly from Corey to me, dated the same month as the sale, in which he explicitly described the arrangement as "you holding my half until I'm back on my feet." It had never been sent to me. He claimed he'd written it and simply never mailed it, keeping it for his own records. I stared at the exhibit copy for a long time in Priya's office. "It's a fake," I said. "I've never seen this letter in my life." "I believe you," Priya said. "Now we have to prove it." We hired a forensic document examiner named Alan Reyes, a quiet, meticulous man who spoke about ink chemistry the way other people talk about their children. He asked for the original letter, not a copy. Corey's attorney resisted for 2 weeks, citing chain of custody concerns, which Priya pointed out in her filing was an unusual objection to raise about a letter that supposedly had been sitting untouched in a drawer for 6 years. When the original finally arrived, Alan spent 4 days on it. His report, when it came, was 11 pages of dense technical language that boiled down to one devastating sentence. The ink used in the signature did not exist on the commercial market until 3 years after the letter's stated date. Corey hadn't just misremembered the past, he had manufactured it. "He's going to say he's not the one who wrote it," Priya warned me, "or that the pen manufacturer's records are wrong. People rarely confess just because the evidence catches up to them." She was right. When his attorney received the report, Corey didn't withdraw the lawsuit. He escalated it, filing a new claim alleging that I must have somehow tampered with the letter to frame him, a theory so thin even his own attorney's filings read like they didn't quite believe it. I remember reading that filing at my kitchen table at midnight, and instead of anger, I felt something quieter and sadder settle over me. My brother wasn't fighting to get the house back anymore. He was fighting to avoid admitting, in front of a judge, in front of our family, in front of himself, exactly what kind of man he'd become. The hearing was held on a gray October morning in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee. Corey sat 2 tables away from me in a suit that looked borrowed, his jaw tight, refusing to look in my direction. His attorney opened with the loan theory, painting me as a calculating older sister who'd exploited her brother's financial desperation. I watched 2 jurors because Corey had insisted on a jury, against, I later learned, his own attorney's advice, nod along sympathetically at the opening lines. Then Priya stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She laid out the timeline like a builder laying brick. The notarized deed, Ruth Cassidy's contemporaneous log entry, the recorded transfer at the county clerk's office 3 days after signing, the bank wires with their auto-generated memo line, and finally, Alan Reyes's report on the ink. When she got to the letter, she held it up for the jury like a piece of evidence in a magic trick about to be exposed. "The plaintiff would have you believe this letter sat in a drawer for 6 years, she said. "Our expert's analysis shows the ink itself did not exist for the first 3 of those years. Someone wrote this letter recently, and then dated it to look old." I watched the color drain slightly from Corey's face. His attorney's pen stopped moving across his legal pad. On cross-examination, Corey's own version of events began to fracture in real time. He couldn't explain why he'd told Aunt Louise the house was held for him, but never mentioned it to anyone for 6 years. He couldn't explain why he'd used the phrase "done with the place" to a licensed notary if he'd never intended the transfer to be permanent. He couldn't explain the ink. "I don't remember exactly when I wrote it," he finally said, staring at the table instead of the jury. "Maybe I got the date wrong." It was the first honest sentence he'd said in the entire proceeding, and it destroyed the rest of his case in a way no cross-examination question could have. The judge dismissed the quiet title claim with prejudice. On the fraud counterclaim, filed by Priya on my behalf. Once the forged letter came to light, the jury took less than 2 hours to find in my favor, awarding damages that, combined with the attorney's fees the judge ordered Corey to reimburse me for, came close to matching what he'd once been paid for his half of the house in the first place. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that courtroom. I felt hollowed out, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long, your arms forgot what it was like to be empty. Corey caught up with me in the parking lot, the same kind of gray October light falling over both of us that had been there the day I was served. "I just wanted what was fair," he said quietly. "The land's worth a fortune now. I never should have sold it that cheap. You sold it because you needed cash, and I was the only person willing to give it to you fast," I said. "That's not unfair. That's the deal you asked for. You could have just given me more when the marina thing happened. Instead, you let your lawyer humiliate me in front of a jury. I offered you a fair conversation 11 months ago before any of this started," I said. "You sent a lawsuit instead, and then you sent a forged letter. I didn't put that ink in that pen, Corey. You did." He didn't have an answer for that. He looked, for just a moment, like the boy who used to sit beside me on the dock at Blackwater Point, feet dangling over water our grandfather had taught us both to respect. Then the moment passed, and he turned and walked to his car without another word. I didn't see Corey again for nearly a year. Aunt Louise eventually called to apologize awkwardly for taking his side so quickly, and I told her I understood that people believe the story that's told to them first and loudest, and it isn't always their fault for not questioning it sooner. Marisol texted me a simple, "I'm sorry, I should have asked more questions," which I appreciated more than I expected to. I kept the house. Larkspur Shoreline Partners eventually built their marina community next door, and Blackwater Point's value climbed even higher than the number that had started this whole fight. I could have sold it for an enormous profit. I thought about it for exactly one afternoon. Instead, I did something my mother would have understood better than anyone. I put half the property, the undeveloped acreage running along the water where our father used to fish at dawn, into a permanent conservation easement, so it could never be subdivided or sold to a developer, no matter who owned it next. The house itself I kept, and I finally repainted the shutters the pale green my mother had always wanted and never gotten around to. Last spring, I stood on that same dock at sunrise, coffee in hand, and thought about how strange it was that the fight had never really been about the house at all. It had been about who got to decide what the truth was, and whether being loud and desperate enough could rewrite 6 years of paper trails and a notary's careful handwriting. It couldn't. It never can. Not really. Not if you're patient enough to wait for the truth to surface on its own. I don't know if Corey and I will ever speak again the way we used to, as children on this same dock with our whole lives ahead of us, but I know the house is safe now. Safe from him, safe from developers, safe in the quiet, permanent way my parents would have wanted. And some mornings, that's enough. Some mornings, watching the mist lift off the water exactly the way it did when I was 7 years old and certain nothing bad could ever happen to this family, is more than enough.